let's start with Markdown. Like,
Yeah.
what is Markdown? Give me the
So, I mean,
backstory.
at the simplest level, Markdown is a format for a plain text file, which, there's a lot of precedent going back many, many years, which is sort of just the convention a lot of people follow. If you want to do a bulleted list, you put an asterisk at the beginning of the line, and then put your text after it. And, what John Gruber did was sort of recognize, one, that that's a behavior that people have, and two, that that was how he liked to write his blog posts, and then, made a little, basically a Perl script that would take that and in a consistent way transform that into HTML markup for his blog. And he made that a plugin for a content management system called Movable Type, which I was the product manager for, back in the day. You were going back now at this point, 25 years ago, which is I'm starting to feel the age of saying that. But it was kind of the WordPress of its time, and it's hard to remember how small the internet was back then. But at that time, it was sort of uh, to be a little immodest, it was kind of the entirety of like influencer media and social media. It was, if you took all of WordPress and all of Substack and kind of all of the influencers on even YouTube and stuff, all those things didn't exist then, or Instagram. Everybody who wanted to have a presence online as an individual and have a voice online was on that platform.
Yeah.
And so that was a super, super influential platform. And John had recognized that because a lot of those other folks weren't very technical, the easier you could make it to make rich formatting, and not just bullet points, but bold, italics, and links and images, without having to learn HTML and without the risk of breaking the formatting of your site, the more powerful it was going to be. And my personal lens on it was, um, I mean, this is again one of those things that tells you how long ago it was. There was no such field or practice in the industry as developer relations or developer experience. I had that role, but there wasn't a title for it. And so I was creating, what would today be called sort of a developer platform or whatever. And it was really part of me launching our ability to have plugins. And that was really one of the first ones. And so I would say from my POV, it was probably the greatest success I've had in developer relations was
Yeah.
helping to shepherd, Markdown out to the internet. And he made a brilliant thing. He beta tested it with our mutual late friend, Aaron Swartz, who had great feedback for him, and put it out in the world, and it was immediately a success. Everybody sort of saw the value of it. And then, for a couple years, it was sort of a slow roll. And then, you go maybe 5, 6 years down the road, and um, it was picked up in short order, then in rapid succession by GitHub, and I'd seen the founders sort of there implement it in their as soon as they made that ability to show a README, and Stack Overflow, where I was very close with the founding team and on the board, and saw them, especially Jeff Atwood, who was very vocal about sort of trying to standardize the way that Markdown worked on that site. And of course, those two sites also both each had their own flavors of Markdown, but particularly because everybody on Stack Overflow and everybody on GitHub were developers, since they were exposed to Markdown in the place where developers got together, they then perpetuated it, building into their own tools. And that's when you had this flourishing of it.
Yeah. And then now it's kind of, I mean, it's the lifeblood of blogging. It's the lifeblood of a lot of headless CMS, all the code via GitHub that you spread. But it's all like you talked about, but it's also the lifeblood of everything AI right now, LLM, like coding assistant. And in my realm, like we've gone from XML to, I mean, your realm too, but XML to JSON to YAML. There's this kind of entropy or decomposition happening. And I feel like Markdown is that minimum viable for context and structure and feeding the LLM beasts, I guess.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's interesting because it's sort of the control plane for AI. and you could have the most cutting edge, advanced LLM, frontier model from $1 trillion company, and you're making a plain text markdown file to try and orchestrate it, right? And in the most low tech basic play, like you can use Windows Notepad. Well, I guess Notepad has an LLM in it these days, but
Uh,
like you can use, you can be in Vim and making this plain text file, and it's going to be how you control it. And I think that's a pretty extraordinary thing. I was talking to a friend the other day and saying it almost feels like what Unix pipes are, but the next layer of the stack up. It's that, pervasive, and that default a level of piping information through, of connecting through, and a default assumption. And there is one other thing that I think was really non-obvious to me at the beginning, but that has stuck with me is in the early days and in the first several years, as a coder and a person that builds systems, it made me very itchy that it was so non-standard. I knew there were edge cases where it's like, well, you didn't tightly specify what to do with this.
Mhm.
And I was like, that's wrong. It's not technically correct.
Yeah.
And now with the hindsight of 20 plus years, I still, it makes me itchy to say this. I think that's part of why it succeeded.
Yeah.
And I hate to say that, but that is the real world. And the example I would point to that illustrates this is HTML itself, right? Which is that, and now you and I know that there is a tight specification, right? So HTML5, like post 5 era, is tightly specified. But HTML that got adopted,
Yeah.
was might as well have been scrawled on the back of an envelope, and around the same era, actually, within months of when Markdown was created, is really when RSS became what it was. Like the spec had been around and people were adopting it, but when RSS like really took off, and the way that it would be used to support podcasting and all these things that it took off, um, it was, subject to quite emotional and pointed and very tense battles within the community by people who were like, we absolutely have to standardize it, and there needs to be a formal XML spec, and we're going to take it to ITF. And I was very much part of that community and a very big believer in it. And none of that amounted to a hill of beans.
Yeah.
Like the thing that actually worked was like just kind of make it work, and like we'll run some conformance tests and somebody make a little, a profile that's like kind of good enough. And that's one of those things that I think has been a really interesting lesson, and especially for me, been very instructive about how I look at community and developer relations,
Yeah.
the technical specs, and what it takes to make things succeed, and also that the bias I had towards, understandably, technical correctness and standardization also makes things easier for big companies to take over, and for capture by the people who have a budget to send somebody to a standards meeting
Mhm.
or to run a standards body, and to what becomes enshittification, and all these other things, or to being tied into a SaaS service and a subscription, and an enterprise suitability. And I'm like, maybe I don't want enterprise extensions in my spec,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Because I Markdown enterprise grade would have probably been a nightmare, actually.
Yeah.
And so the fact that it is a little bit of a toy is part of why it's so good. And so that was that's a difference between what I thought then and what I know now,
Yeah.
with half my life has passed since
Yeah.
Markdown was born.
Got a lot more wisdom, a lot more experience. You've seen the reality, I mean, continued experiencing of the messy variety world that we live in, diverse, in all the good ways. I say those with all
Yeah.
the positive, sense. And, in the API, we went from SOA to service-oriented architecture, which was
Yeah.
very heavy top down. And then this like happy accident called REST slash J,
Yeah.
kind of, came out and it's stuck, but everyone keeps trying to come with some new thing on top of it. OAuth is
Yeah.
fast becoming this bloated craziness because of everyone adding this enterprise on top of it. And so
You
it
know,
seems like you have to have this kind of balance in there.
we go through these expansion contraction cycles, and I've seen that go through so many times. So in the same company, There's a company called Six Apart that we made at CMS, Movable Type, and later on we acquired LiveJournal, which was one of the first social networks, and they did so much pioneering work. They made Memcache, and in the room with these guys, these folks, we um, created the first versions of OpenID and worked with teams to make OAuth and OEmbed and and other things. And the first versions were Markdown style. Like I could implement them even as a lousy coder.
Mhm.
And then they all kind of got enterprised up. And at the time, as a DevRel, DevX kind of person, I was so excited. Like, oh, Microsoft's on board. Awesome.
Yeah,
you know? And
yeah,
then you got to the version that was enterprise grade, and IBM was on board. And what I thought was validation made it impossible to implement. All of a sudden, I was like, how do you, what do you, like, I don't understand this.
yeah,
I can't now. What I used to be able to hack together by viewing source is going to take me all weekend just to get it running. And none of this has to do with my actual app,
yeah,
And um, that was really humbling about what I thought mattered and what am I really trying to achieve here and how much of it was ego about me wanting to have a thing on my resume and later my LinkedIn
mhm,
that said created standard that was adopted by
mhm,
insert billion-dollar company name here
yeah,
versus what I really care about, which was here's the thing all these people use that they make real
yeah,
things with.
yeah,
And that's a thing that only it does come with experience and does come with what do you really care about? What do you value? And also, one of the reasons I wrote this piece about Markdown very unapologetically was to remember, my friend Aaron Swartz,
yeah,
and to have it be the real version of him. He was an activist, very much so, and proudly so. But one of the double, edged parts of that is that since he passed when he was very young, there's sort of been a mythology that sprung up around him, and people will put, this sort of halo exalted. And he was a wonderful person and had great values, but it makes it a little less real version of him. And so I wanted to give a little bit of the sort of funnier and pricklier and whatever version of him. And so and even John too, John's been a friend for again 25 years now. And to if somebody, I think Hacker News or something was kind of like I'd open the piece by mentioning like he's a he's a friend of I think it said a indefensible sports team, and they were like, why does he say this terrible thing about this guy? And I'm like, you got to be able to like poke your friend, what I mean? Like it's kind of like you're just busting his chops, and I think they just didn't realize like these are people.
mhm,
This is somebody I text to ask how his kid is doing. This is like it's real life, and I think people have not understood that the entire internet is made of like regular people who in between going out for beers together or did you plant your seeds for your garden this spring yet
mhm.
are viewing source and copying and pasting, and that's what it is. That's how it was made, and that's how it could be made again.
Yeah. I mean, how do you reconcile? I mean, you've been in this as long as I have, it's this entire century, literally.
Yeah.
And that original vision, I think that we really rode on that first wave. I mean, how do you reconcile with what we've got today? And, from Google to,
Yeah.
to AI to just the enshittified kind of, what's going on to DevRel, like social media. I can't even do a lot of the storytelling and
Yeah.
blogging that I used to do.
Well, there's been times I've lost faith and been so disheartened by how awful it is, right? Because you think about how much of our careers we made on being out there on social media and making real connections. That's how we connected, right? And then, I don't want to belabor it too much, but I think of how much of my people who've known me online or that I made my reputation would be on a platform like Twitter. And, now I'm not on there and,
Yeah.
people are sharing, abuse images on there as you and I record this. And
Yeah.
so like I'm not ever going to be on that platform again.
Yeah.
And which I think is very simple to understand, right? And so how much further could it fall? Right? Like it's the thing that we used to use as the example of the definitive worst harm you could be in the world, right? And so we grieve that because we're human, and then you say, well, then it must be over, right? But
Mhm.
at the same time, I just was looking at like New Year's Day. Um, Steve Yagi put out his piece on Gastown, right? And it's this beautiful madness. Like I just truly love the like when a great coder is in full mad scientist mode, you know, and he's like, what if we just have bots talking to bots talking to bots? Like we've just got like it's AI all the way down. And but it's so sincere. There's no part of what he's built that was like, oh, my corporate overlords, a giant AI company, whatever, told me to do this. He was like, I'm going to look at this tech as an individual with no agenda except I want to make something of it and see what a future I can imagine on my own terms and write about it and create from it purely of my own. I went to the mountaintop to meditate on it myself. I was in the cave creating myself. I think of or like, Iron Man in the cave beating his, the hammer to make his armor together. And that's his vision, right? And then I think of Simon Willison, right, who's just points on the board, like just whittling away every day a little bit. And there's just another blog post. This is just what I found, just what I found. No hype, no mark, just like I just made this thing. And I'm just going to tell you what I saw. Both of those guys have been doing that for 20 plus years. And I know there's zero chance they wrote that thing because somebody cut them a check.
Mhm.
There's zero chance I that anything that they write is not backed up by the code that they ran on their machine.
Mhm. Yeah.
And there are many more like I'm just those are the ones that I've been looking at just right in the last couple of days, right?
Yeah.
And um and they never stopped, right? And there has to be some young coder on the other side of the world and she's reading it. And she's like, I can do that.
Huh.
I can write a blog post every day. I
Yeah.
can write about the code that I'm writing. And I don't know who she is yet. I haven't seen her blog yet,
Huh.
you know? And she's going to make that same mad scientist discovery about here's the next wave creating. And then everybody will like of our cohort, of the people that like make because we can't not make. This is my medium. Like
Yeah.
I'm a lousy singer. I'm a lousy piano player. Do you know what I mean? Like I'm never gonna make something in those media. But this is how I've made things. Like I make the web because the web gave me everything in my life. It gave me my career and all my opportunity. So the next person that shows me how to make something great on the web is my friend.
Yeah.
And so
Yeah.
when she makes that thing and she writes that thing, I'm like, you made it. That's cool. And she makes the next markdown or whatever it is, then we will lift it up and exalt it. And like you can't stop that. Like there is no way there's not somebody doing that right now. And it will look different too, because I do look at, whatever category of thing Gastown is in. I keep thinking of this as like software zero or like post code, or codeless, right? Like serverless was not really serverless. Codeless is not really codeless, but it's sort of you're making machines that write code for you and almost treat the code as like it actually is like I haven't written assembly since I was a kid, right? But I write code that makes assembly.
Mhm.
And I don't vet that it did the assembly right. I trust that it did. There's a non-zero chance that by the end of this year I'll be making machines that make code and I don't vet that they made the code right.
Yeah.
I have feelings about that because I love making code. But there was a time when I would check the assembly. you
Yeah.
know?
Yeah.
So like the stack squishes, but like every time we had a 7-layer stack diagram, every part of that used to be a 7-layer stack itself. It's
Mhm.
fractal,
Yeah.
right? So we compress the stack down. We may be going through the painful birthing process of compressing the entire thing we thought of as software creation into one layer of the stack for the next thing. And so we're sort of smushing it all down. And it's almost like everything that we've known as our careers of writing software is like IL bytecode.
Yeah. Yeah.
And now we're going to be up a level of abstraction. And that's a hard transition to make psychologically, but intellectually, we can understand it. So now we think of what was the job of an architect and a product manager is now what we do as software authoring.
Yeah.
So if that's it, and this is the new codeless world, the new software zero world, and somebody who's born into that world, and she's from this century, not like me from the last century, and she writes as somebody native to that world who's only ever known Markdown's always existed for.
Yeah. Yeah.
I'm excited to see what that person writes and to recognize it as the version of what I read Aaron writing, and that I could read what he wrote when he was 13. And even then, I was like, man, why is a teenager teaching me?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
be initially a little threatened, and then be like, all right, fine, it's the future. That's how the future feels the first time. A little scary.
Yeah,
And
it's
then,
it's
and then,
it's very scary. I recently had someone, won't mention who it was. They're at Salesforce, and I had shared, I forget which one of your last ones on, being a developer in this world, and then I had also, or they had seen Tim O'Reilly write a story about a vision, and they said, they were asking me, they're like, well, Anil's vision is kind of makes me anxious and makes me nervous, and where Tim O'Reilly's gives me hope. And I kind of articulated to them that, Tim's I've worked with Tim in the US government, done a lot of work with him. He's what I would consider hopeful, visionary, right above the API line. And you're right at the API line. And I would say a lot of what you speak to speaks below the API line. I mean, to people who so I'm talking more the economic rather than just the technical. Like, do you have the skills? Do you have the resources? And I feel like where your last couple of stories really resonated with me is that line continues to shift and move up and down. And some people
yeah,
are going to be caught off guard or left behind, whatever. I hate using that phrase, but and so I feel like you're speaking below the line and at the line and helping educate people, of that technical switch, that paradigm switch, but also the economic. But I worry that a lot of people are going to be drowning in the economics of
there
it.
is a threat here. There is a danger here. And Tim, I've been friends with Tim for 20 plus years. Um, and I think, Tim's an optimist at nature. So I think part of
Yeah,
the reason that it's
that's true.
positive is he writes that way. I am too. I am an optimist, but we are in, I'm an American. We are in the darkest moment in the history of this country, certainly since the Civil War, and certainly in my lifetime. So one, that just sort of colors everything. I think two, um, Tim has access to a lot of, power and resource, and it's easier to be optimistic then. I do too. I have a lot of privilege, but I'm also closer to a lot of people who don't and spend a lot more time proximate to that. And so I tend to write for that and focus on that and unapologetically so. That's just who I think my audience is, and it's just more interesting to me to write to that because I think a lot of people, are on LinkedIn being like, let me write for, my boss or whatever. And it's just not as interesting to me just because that's well covered.
Yeah,
It's very easy to tell comforting things to your boss.
yeah,
Um, and also, frankly, I got to do a lot of that. I was a CEO for many years, and you have a very tight constraint on what you can say, and it has to fit within what VCs want to hear if you're doing a venture-backed startup. And so I fit, as neatly as I could within that. I don't have an interest in that and don't have to do that right now, you know. And I'm just being very honest, it's not. I feel an obligation to make sure I'm telling the rest of the story. Um, but I think the other part is my highest mandate that I feel these days is to teach how systems work. And especially for people who are early in their careers or in a vulnerable part of their careers. Because if you can understand the system, then you can have control and power in it. And, you learn more about your code through the bugs and debugging it, right, than you did when you wrote it.
Yeah.
So I'm always trying to help people debug it. And people, I think, often see that as me being more critical than I am.
Yeah.
Like debugging is an act of hope. You are trying to make it run, and it is, I think, a kindness to offer a bug report.
Yeah.
Like pull requests welcome is a invitation to join a community. And so that's sort of my lens in writing critical things. Now, not everybody hears them that way. I know that, but that's sort of where I'm coming. I don't ever want to demoralize people. I don't want people to see me being critical of these things. I mean, there are times when I'm like, that person's doing a bad thing, like that, or that's like not a moral decision for a company to make or whatever. Like that, obviously, like a bad thing is a bad thing. But hopefully for individuals, I think one of the most important things I want them to understand is like, especially in the technology industry, people have so much power. If you know how technology works, you are able to write code, you are able to understand how the code is evolving. You can have so much power in this world. And I think people understandably right now feel scared or worried and feel threatened. And as I'd mentioned in a recent piece, just in the tech industry in US alone, 500,000 tech workers have been laid off in the last 3 years. Of course, people are scared and worried. That's a reasonable reaction to have to that. Let's understand that and then figure out how we get back the feeling of having some control and some power. Like understand why that's happening, understand how to take our skills and evolve them into whatever's next and have the agency and control. And but being realistic about that, right? I think the first step of it is like you're not crazy. You're not imagining it, because I think that's what so much of the response and the reaction has been. It's like, oh, just the fact that nobody was saying it. And I was talking to a friend yesterday. I was saying, one of the reasons I mentioned this is like, there's a lot with good reason. There's a lot of talk about, oh, how many, coal miners were displaced or whatever. Like I have tremendous empathy for them, but the total number of people who are coal miners in America is 50,000. Not how many were laid off, just total workers is 50,000. 10 times as many people as that is how many people were cut in tech.
Yeah.
And yet there's no
Yeah.
news stories and headlines and whatever. That's weird,
Yeah.
at the very
Yeah.
least.
Yeah.
So we should give voice to it and be, you know, kind to one another about it and caring about it. And then help each other build paths towards where we go next and where we find our opportunities and how do we build something new. But on the other hand, then I can say, okay, well, guess what? We've got people that are looking at there's something new. Part of the reason I mention, Simon and Steve and these other guys is there's an interesting thing. I think the wealthiest, most powerful people in our industry. They've been banging this drum for 15 years. Software is eating the world. They use that to get as much power and wealth as they wanted. They've gotten it. And then if we look at the fact that like what we're talking about is systems that build software at incredible, unimaginable scale from an individual to the point where it's almost like disposably cheap, right? Like we can be personally so productive that we can, like I could imagine building a system where it's making competing versions of the same app, testing them, see which one's the best, and throwing away 90% of my implementations of that app, right? Like competing for it. It's too cheap to meter how I make my software.
Yeah.
In that world of sort of like software zero, uh, the people who made all of their power and wealth on software eating the world, what kind of power do they have?
Yeah. Yeah.
Maybe things change.
Yeah.
Maybe things change more to the people who understand this new,
Yeah. I
you
like
know,
that.
and
There's
like that's an exciting
opportunity.
potential.
There's
Yeah.
opportunity being able to find the signal in the noise at this scale to be able to sift through it and find whatever's next. And I mean, like, around the turn of the century, like, the big oracles, big SAPs, they seemed massive to us. Like you couldn't do mapping without massive
No.
resources. You couldn't do, there's so many, you can do payments without massive resources, things like that.
You couldn't do a database without paying millions of dollars in rent to Oracle. And then that team I worked with, Brad Fitzpatrick, who created LiveJournal, and he worked with Lisa Phillips, and the two of them went and hacked together and made Memcache so that they could scale commodity open source MySQL,
Mhm.
right? And many other people contributed many other things, but that thing change the economics of like, I guess this piece of crap open source thing is going to be good enough for us to do our databases at scale. And that's the reason they were able to scale the first social network to get to millions of users, which was LiveJournal, right?
Yeah.
And then Memcache was used. Like the first time I met Mark Zuckerberg, so he came in to ask Brad, how do you scale a social network? Right? I wish maybe he hadn't told him, but also, and Jimmy Wales came in to ask how to do, Wikipedia and on and on and on. And Matt Mullenweg came in to ask about WordPress. But this is how, tech can actually invent capability that you can't imagine. And that is what the turn of the century looked like. It's like you could make a new way of doing things that reinvents what we think is possible through open tech. But the people, but classic line, right? If you want to predict the future, invent it, right? And so I think that's this piece where like we are at another one of those inflection points. And there are a lot of people top down saying it's going to be this, it's going to be this, it's going to be this. And culturally, a ton of people are saying stop inflicting it on us. Stop making it so when I go into Google Docs, you are jumping in front of me with the Gemini prompt instead of letting me type.
Yeah.
Right? Like,
Yeah.
stop doing that. And there's a lot of us that say, I can imagine making something people want.
Yeah.
Maybe I should make things people want and are actually going to willingly adopt
Yeah.
consensually, right? And so that thing I think is wide open again. And sort of last thing I'll say in that is like to your point about like who's the big players, who are the incumbents. It's hard for people to imagine, but the thing when we were building a company in 2001, there was the 800-pound gorilla that we couldn't imagine how to compete with. It was AOL.
It's so
Because
true.
they owned the category. They were a third of Americans connected to the internet through them. So whatever they bundled with their dial-up access was going to win the category no matter what. They had all the money in the world. They had bought the biggest media with Time Warner so they could even distribute their stuff through advertising on their platform. They had all the chips. They
Yeah.
controlled everything. How could we possibly compete with AOL?
Yeah. Yeah. Remember how big Yahoo was? I mean,
I
I just
do.
remember it being massive, being huge, such
They
a
they
powerhouse.
were they were number one in news, number one in search, number one in sports, number one in finance, number one in weather. Every category, number one in photos. Number you go down the list. They were number one in all of those categories. Unsurmountable lead. Couldn't possibly be beaten.
Ask the kids today, what do you think of Yahoo? What?
Who?
What? Who?
What are they? Never heard of them.
Well, and I'm listening to a book right now on the stock market and the crash, and it was, the end. I mean, it was break, the barons, and they were massive, and they seemed unmovable,
Mhm.
at those times, and that caused that whole, roaring 20s phase. And things change. Things, no matter, and that's a very physical, tangible world. This is digital, so it's kind of the velocity is even greater. So,
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah.
So those are the things that give me, hope. And I also just am very much a student of history and cycles, right? And you talk about that time 100 years ago. It's like, oh, you had a pandemic, and then you had a sort of global rise of an authoritarian movement, and then you had
Mhm.
some economic hard times, and you know
Mhm.
what I mean? It's like, and then what? Right? What happened with labor? And what happened with artistic
Civil
movements and
civil
creativity?
rights and
And what
and
happened with
and
civil rights? And what
yeah.
happened with jazz music? And you know what I mean? Like, and there's this part. How did what happened with film after that? You know what I mean? And so there are parts of this that are cause for optimism. And it takes time. And, I do think about it's a rest of my life effort. It's not, this is going to be 2 years. All right, fine,
Yeah.
fine. Okay.
Yeah, well, I like that. I think that's probably a good place to end on. But I mean, I'm in this business just looking for stories. I love the hustle, startup hustle. I love making money, good money, similar to you, but I'm looking for stories, and this has contributed to that. So thank you. And thanks for all your
Very
work. I
well.
mean, and whatever you do next, I mean, come back and talk to me about it, but don't stop blogging because that's, I think, pretty critical that you keep doing that.
I feel like we got so many stories to tell. And what I would say is I want everybody who has the ability to be blogging, to narrate their stories, because there's such a hunger for it. You will find that everybody wants to see there. They want to have more real things, more experiences. They want to hear more of the stories. So that's the thing I beseech everybody to do is like take a minute. And you don't have to be some elaborate storyteller. It doesn't have to be 10,000 words. Just a little bit of that every day, as often as you can, I think is so valuable.